us this new identity. Daughters and sons of God, whether we accept it or not, we are daughters and sons of God. The Eucharist tells us that. We are a community, united to the triune God and united to one another, and therefore we are grateful. This is all risky business, because there is never an assurance that the receiver will respond back in love. Love, by definition, is risky business. Love takes risks. The wonderful thing about God's own love for us is that even in the face of our rejection of God and God's love, God loves us still. Love is risky business. I do recall at a similar conference like this one, though a little larger, 7 years ago in Houston, Texas, at another airport hotel, and Reverend David Chen, Reverend Chun-Chi Wang were there. It was the first convocation of Asian American Presbyterians convened by our former moderator, Dr. Syngman Rhee, the first Asian American moderator of the Presbyterian Church. That's where I met the woman who would become my wife 13 months later after the convocation. That goes to show that you can find love at Presbyterian conferences. But it was risky. It was risky for both of us. What would this all mean? She from New Jersey and me from California. A long-distance relationship? A seminary student courting a business executive? Love is risky. The rest, as they say, is history. Love enters the unfamiliar, the other, and engages the unfamiliar territory in an effort to know more, in an effort to understand, in a deep and genuine desire to get into the shoes of the other. What would it mean if we ourselves, the people around us, if we saw ourselves and others and the world and the church and God through God's heart and God's eyes? Imagine the revolution of what would happen if we took on God's eyes and God's heart. Seeing yourself through the lenses of God's eyes and God's heart, you would see someone who is so beloved of God, who is treasured by God, who is formed perfectly in God's image, who has been gifted with gifts and talents and skills, who holds a special place in God's heart. What if you saw others through God's eyes and God's heart? You would see that cranky person, that cranky deacon, as one who is so loved by God, that God's own Son died and rose for him. You would see your co-worker as one who is tired, and whose soul is tired, and who seeks rest. You would see your small congregation as like a mustard seed, so much potential, a treasure of people who love God and love each other, no matter how small it may be. You would see your pastor, not as a paid staff servant to serve you and your needs, but as a fellow beggar, a beggar who offers you bread, but who himself or herself needs bread that you may be able to extend with your own hand. For pastors, you may see your congregation through God's own eyes and God's heart as Christ's little lambs. Christ's little lambs entrusted to your care, who seek a word of peace, a word of grace, a soothing balm of community life, a touch of love in their daily and weekly struggles of trying too hard to live right. What if you saw the world through God's own eyes and God's own heart? We will find a world where there is a lot of hurt and pain, a world that needs to be loved as it is a world that loves in return. You know, one of the young adults in my congregation responded to God's call to spend 3 months in Palestine, to learn Arabic and to volunteer at a peace center, to live with a family, a Palestinian family, to help children and be loved by the Palestinians as he loves them. In fact, he's coming back this coming Thursday. He knew it was risky business being there, but he loves as he himself is being loved by Palestinians. Love is risky business. And because God is love, in order for love to penetrate and permeate what we do and how we do things and how we serve and who we serve. We are in constant need of abiding with the God who is love. Thankfully, God abides with us and is a constant presence when we don't abide with God. Do more by doing less. For us to do more loving. For us to more serve, to serve better. For us to do more preaching and more teaching. For us to do what needs to be done while doing less would require for God to take the load, all of it, like the farm yoke that is placed on 2 farm animals to pull the plow. Either equal loads will have to be carried, or a transfer of most of the load, if not all of the load, upon God. God's way is to take the full load, even when we are not willing to let go of the load. We hold our responsibilities and leadership with tight fists, unrelenting in our pursuit for control over things. We want to do things our way and hold the entire load. I think our thought is that God is well pleased when we suffer for God, when we sacrifice for God, when God sees that our strength is being sapped, God will reward us. God has a different approach. God's way is a riskier way. God's way is to slowly unwrap your fingers from the joystick and to gradually walk away from the control panels, and where He calls us to abide in Him, to remain in Him, to walk alongside with Him. He is basically calling us to love. Take a risk and love me. Love me. To demonstrate this, Jesus speaks about the vine and the branches. There are 2 interesting phenomena with the nature of vines. The first interesting fact about vines is what happens below the ground. There's an article that I read in the September 2003 edition of Sky magazine from Delta Airlines. You could tell that I fly a lot. And this was in the question and answer section from readers about wine and vines. Here's the reader's question. There's a wine geek friend of mine who made a passing remark recently about a wine being particularly tasty because it was produced from grapes that were, as she put it, stressed. What's that? What are stressed grapes? Here's the answer from the magazine editors. We all acknowledge that life is stressful, but now do we have to deal with over-anxious, stressed wine grapes? Come on already. Enough with the verbal silliness of wine devotees. However, stressing grapes is actually an ancient method of viticulture, or grape growing, designed to strain grapevines in order to produce extraordinarily good clusters of grapes that will, after fermentation and maturation, make better than average wines. Grapes are a lot like people. When they are forced, within reason, to struggle to reach their optimum ripeness, they frequently do their best work. Stressing most typically involves refraining from irrigating vineyards during the height of the growing season, forcing the vine's root systems to reach farther and farther into the subsoil for nutrients and moisture. Water deprivation often results in grapes that are more intensely flavored. Grapes grown on vines that have been forced to claw for every bit of sustenance are typically the foundation for the world's hallmark vines. I can't stress this enough, he says. This is what happens when water is deprived, when vines are deprived of water and the branches that are connected to that vine. The vine will dig deeper to get the water that is needed. Does this mean that we should seek to be deprived of water so that the vines will dig deeper? That would be like the question posed to the Apostle Paul in Romans, shall I continue to sin so that God's grace may abound? Certainly not. But what